Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our program titled The Torah of Human Dignity, Exploring What It Means to Be Created in the Image of the Divine with Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. We will spend our evening together discussing what Jewish tradition teaches us about living with integrity and concern for other people through an exploration of a section of Talmud tractate Ta'anit. The ethical lessons that our tradition has to teach us are so important in the world today as we continue to grow and struggle with how to be in relationship with those who lead different lives from our own. I look forward to hearing the insights and lessons that Rabbi Tuchman has to share with us. As usual, if you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. We'll discuss as many as we can at the end of the lecture. And I now welcome Dr. Sandy Mendelson, a member of our Haberman Institute board, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks also to Becky Levy behind the scenes. I've been involved with the Haberman Institute for 2 decades as a board member, president, program committee chair, and most importantly, as an engaged learner in our community. Welcome to our hundreds of Zoom participants from the Washington area and around the world. We are looking forward to this evening's program, The Torah of Human Dignity, exploring what it means to be created in the image of God. The Haberman Institute is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. Our aim is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. I'm very excited about our future programs. Here are the next 2 coming soon. Next Wednesday, March 15th, Diversity and Eloquence, Jewish Life in Wartime North Africa. May I remind you that that was the Vichy era of Nazi occupation, fascist governments. It should be intriguing to learn about what Jewish life was like under that regime. Our presenter is Professor Sarah Abravaya Stein from UCLA, a prominent historian of Sephardic Jewry. On Monday, March 27th, the Avi West Memorial Lecture will be presented by Dr. David Arno, a psychologist and scholar of the Festival of Passover. His topic is Redemptive Hope and Fulfillment, Inspiration for Your Passover Seder. We invite you to learn much more about these and other programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. Now for tonight's speaker. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman grew up in the Washington area. Judaism did not play a central role in her childhood home, but she became more connected to religion at college. She pursued a master's degree at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Then, after some time away from academic work, she decided to enter rabbinical school. As a rabbinical student, Lauren found that both inside and outside of the classroom, she was animated by the question of how to make sustainable change in Jewish communities. Because she was the first blind rabbinical student her professors and fellow students had worked with, she found herself calling attention to and challenging traditional readings of Jewish texts that marginalized people with disabilities. During her training and since her ordination, working with a variety of communal organizations, Rabbi Tuchman has used Torah and other traditional sources to develop a theology of inclusion. This is extremely important work, creating a Judaism for today in a world in which each person's distinctive embodied experience is valued. She is sought after as a speaker, writer, spiritual leader, and educator. She provides consulting to individuals and organizations within the Jewish community on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access, inclusion, and feminism. As far as she is aware, she is the first blind woman in the world to enter the rabbinate. I first met Rabbi Lauren a few years ago when we both attended an adult education program in person. We happened to be assigned to the same study group, the Chevruta, studying a rabbinic text. As I was taking out my Hebrew study sheets, wondering how this would work, I saw that Rabbi Lauren was opening her Braille version of the same. I must say that she read her Braille Hebrew version faster than I could read my printed text. And with this impressive resume, I turn the Zoom over to you, Rabbi Tuchman. I know we are all looking forward to learning with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandy, for such a warm introduction. It is truly an honor to be here with all of you. And I want to thank everyone at the Haberman Institute for bringing me here tonight. And it is such an honor to get to delve into some of these beautiful texts together. So as Sandy so beautifully mentioned in his very warm introduction, one of the things that is very central to me in my work is a theology of inclusion that is grounded in an honest read of traditional Jewish text and also contemporary text. I want to take a moment now in light of very recent loss in our community to note that one of the inspirations behind my work was the late, great Judy Heumann, may her memory be for a blessing. And I had the incredible honor of learning Torah with her, actually at Adas Israel congregation here in the Washington area, in person before the pandemic. It was an incredible moment of getting a chance to sit with one of the greats of the disability rights movement. Often it was just the two of us in the room. Sometimes we had other co-learners as well, but to be able to sit with her and really delve into text and to do it from a disability affirming and affirmative perspective, I think not only was that a tikkun for her, it was certainly a tikkun for me. And I bring that into our learning together tonight because truly Judy Heumann's work was nothing if not entirely about human dignity, about kavod habriot, about treating every single human being with the dignity they are due because of who they are and because we are all inherently made in the image of Hashem. So tonight's talk is going to be focusing mostly on a text from Tractate Ta'anit in the Babylonian Talmud. And Tractate Ta'anit mostly deals with fasts, but actually has an entire chapter about human behavior because the rabbis believed that there was a connection between how you behaved and how the world worked. Now, we may not hold their theology as literally as they do, but I think that there's a lot to teach us about how the way we show up in the world is deeply how it impacts others, it impacts our world, and it impacts ourselves. There's no doubt that we are living in a world that is in sore need, in desperate need of a greater emphasis on the inherent dignity of every human being. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to some of the formative aspects of my own learning and theology that underpin my text and my talk tonight. And then we're going to share our screen, and I will indicate when I would like to do the screen share, and then we'll do some text learning together. One thing I want to note, I will not be reading the texts inside. So let me put that another way. You will see them on your screen, for those who are able to see the screen, but I will not be reading directly. I am instead going to be narrating the text and doing it much more in an interactive way. So it's not going to be a straightforward reading of the text, but it's going to be more of my interpolation and retelling and exploring and explicating. So just letting folks know, you don't have to follow along. This is a lecture that is fully accessible without looking at the source sheet, but you have the source sheet available to you if you would like it. And so before we do that, I want to just name a few things that are very formative in how I think about text and how I think about Judaism. One of the things that I want to lift up is that in addition to all of the things that Sandy beautifully mentioned, I am a Musar practitioner. And for those on this call who are not as familiar, Musar often gets translated as Jewish ethics or Jewish character development. I prefer to actually think about Musar and its essence is about Jewish soul development. The modern Musar movement, depending on how you count it, was either created or developed in the 19th century in Lithuania, or had its revival in the 90s here in North America, or both. And I think both is true. Rav Israel Salanter in the 19th century in Lithuania realized that a lot of the yeshiva students, Lithuania at that time was a central location for yeshiva learning, realized that a lot of the yeshiva students didn't actually spend a lot of time on cultivating their midot, on their soul traits. We sometimes in English call them character traits, but I prefer the term soul traits. And notice that we need to actually do that if we're going to be well-rounded Jews. That it's not just enough to learn Talmud, as wonderful and as important as Talmud is, but in fact, we must also be constantly working on balancing our midot, our soul traits. And in our Torah reading cycle right now, we are in the midst of learning about the Mishkan, which is the portable sanctuary in the desert. And one of my Musar teachers talks about Musar as the practice of building one's internal Mishkan, and doing so by trying to cultivate a life of holiness through how we show up in relationships with other people, in relationship with ourselves, in relationship with the world, and of course, in relationship with the divine, if that is resonant for you. And ultimately, that is the lens, that is the perspective that I'm going to bring to the text that we're going to look at most in depth tonight. It is not necessarily a classic Musar text, but I believe it is very Musar appropriate. And it goes to the ikar, to the main thrust of the lecture tonight, which is about the Torah of human dignity. I want to lift up, and I believe he is taught at this institution, that I was first introduced to this text in Ta'anit by one of my very beloved professors at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Dr. Bert Vizatsky. And I have taught this many, many times in his honor, and I am grateful to him for allowing me to inhabit this text and really bringing it to me and saying, this is yours. So I lift up his teaching and his name as I am about to explore this text together with you. And I now want to invite us to open the Zoom, the screen share, excuse me, for folks to be able, if you would like, to follow along. And as I said, we're not going to be reading the source sheet inside, so you do not have to. I also want to name that, as I said before, so much of my inspiration and so much of the desire I have to teach Torah in deeply disability affirming ways is very much connected to my relationship with the late great Judy Heumann, as well as with Cheryl Grossman, who is a disability activist as well. And I bring these women into this conversation because we know, unfortunately, that classical Jewish texts are very focused on men's experience. And as a woman teaching, I try to bring in as many diverse voices as I can, even when they are not directly on the source sheet. That is a very important thing that I try to do, because shiurim or lectures like this should be multivocal. It's very important in our tradition that we not lose the remembrance that, in fact, ours is a tradition of debate and ours is a tradition of multiple interpretations. And so I bring all of these voices tonight as we are about to discover this text together. So before we actually get into the text from Ta'anit, I want to just remind us of this idea of being created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. What exactly does this mean? To be created in the image of God, particularly because ours is a tradition that eschews corporality for God. We believe, the Jewish tradition holds very strongly, that the divine doesn't have a body like human beings do. Now, there are lots of passages in the Talmud and other rabbinic literature that kind of use the human body as a metaphor for God, but it's widely understood and accepted as ironclad Jewish belief and Jewish understanding that God does not have a body. So when we're taught in Genesis, in the very opening parasha, in the opening Torah portion, that we're created B'Tselem Elokim, we get to ask ourselves the question, what is that intended to mean? And there are many commentaries and commentators who try to answer that question over the centuries. And what I prefer is to think about how medieval commentaries and commentators would often say that to be created in the image of God means that we have free will, And that ultimately, we are the ones who control how our lives are going in terms of, I mean, there's so much in our world that we can't control, but we ultimately have, as Rav Eliezer Volli, who is a 20th century Musar master, would talk about, we all have a Bechira point or a choice point where we can choose how to show up in any given situation. If we're thinking about what it means to be created in the image of God, we get to choose how we want to elevate the divinity that's within each of us, in our souls, into the world, or do we want to conceal that divinity? That's up to us. That's up to how we choose to act, and that's up to what we prioritize. And that ultimately is what it means to be created in the image of God, that we are co-creators with God in the renewal of creation every day. There's an idea that is explored in the traditional prayer book every morning that basically says that we renew creation. Every day is a new day, every day is a new start. And of course, that doesn't mean we leave behind yesterday, but it means that we are co-creators with the divine in the project of making this world better than we found it. In the Jewish tradition, we have a strong emphasis on this world. We certainly have an idea in the world to come, for sure, but our religious emphasis is here and now. That our task is to make this world where we are dwelling now a dwelling place for the Shekhinah, for the divine presence, and that is shown up in how we actually choose to show up in our own lives, in our own Arba Amot, in our own little worlds, in our own little corners, and in the wider world. So that's where we get this idea of being created in the image of God. And that's going to carry us through to our next text, which is our central text for tonight, which again is from Ta'anit 20a and b in the Babylonian Talmud. So Tractate Ta'anit, as I said earlier, is focused mostly on fast days. And in the time of the Talmud's redaction in Bavel, there are two Talmuds we're going to be learning. The Babylonian Talmud, that's the more authoritative for many, many reasons. There is another Talmud called the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud, that was mostly compiled, I believe, in the Galil. That is less, quote, authoritative, quote, although many people study it, and it's a very important rabbinic work. But when people talk about studying Talmud, they're mostly talking about the Babylonian Talmud. So this tractate is really focusing a lot on fasting, because if the rains did not fall at particular times, that would have a deleterious impact on people's ability to literally survive. So there were often times when fasts would be called if the rain hadn't fallen yet. And that gets us to our chapter, which is the third chapter of Ta'anit, where the rabbis are exploring lots of this is one of my favorite chapters in Talmud. They're exploring lots of different experiences, or what they would call agadah, or narratives, about different sages and their behavior. Because often behavior was understood to directly impact whether Hashem would give Hashem's bounty and whether we would be able to have the land and the rains come at their time. This might be familiar to some of us because in the Shema, for those who say the second paragraph of the Shema, which is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, there is a direct idea that if we are to obey the commandments, then the rains will come in their proper time. So there is an action-reaction. Many of us today may be very uncomfortable with this midah keneged midah idea, but I think the rabbis understood it as our actions have consequences. We might, and I would strongly advise that we do really iterate on this idea and challenge the ways it gets misused and even abused. But I think if we think about it broadly, that the idea that in fact the way that we show up does have an impact broadly, maybe not cosmologically. That's not my theology personally, but I think certainly on an interpersonal level, it absolutely does. So that's the context. of the tractate and where we are. And this tractate is found in the Seder, in the order of Moed. Of course, we're probably all familiar with the term Seder as we're all thinking about our upcoming Sedarim. But Seder comes from the word for order. So we are in the order of holidays. We are in this chapter in Ta'anit about behavior, and Ta'anit itself is about fasting. Okay, great. So how do we get this particular text? This is one of those interesting texts that's a bit peculiar. As one of my teachers, Rabbi Dorothy Richmond, who I got to learn this with recently, talked about, this is a bit of a peculiar beginning. We're told in the beginning of our text that one should not be stiff like a reed, but should be soft or flexible like should not be stiff like a, excuse me, I'm going to get that mixed up. One should not be stiff like a cedar, but flexible like the reed. One should be like the reed and not stiff like the cedar. Sorry for misspeaking there. Apologies. And then we get this interesting story. So we get this teaching that we should be softer like the reed. We should not be hard like the cedar. Okay, interesting thought. Where are we getting that? What does that actually have to tell us here? So then we are introduced to our main protagonist and antagonist. And we're told that this is probably being given over in the Beit Midrash after the fact, but that only becomes clear at the end of the text. So we'll circle back, and I'm going to, as I said before, I'm going to walk us through this text, and I'm going to be adding some commentary as we go. And then at the end, I'm going to zoom out, pardon the pun, and give more of a broader take on this text. So we have Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, and we have Reka. Now, I want to pause here and name. Reka comes from the Hebrew word for empty. This is in reference to a man who we will be introduced to very shortly. The only thing we know about this man is that according to Rabbi Elazar, he is ugly. We don't know anything about this man. I think that's a very important piece that we need to hold as we are going through this text. We know this is not made explicit in the text, and this is why I think it's very important to name this. Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is actually the son of Rashbi, of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And some folks may be familiar. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is understood to be the author of the Zohar. Now, academics would disagree with that, but traditionally, he's understood to be the author of the Zohar. But more immediately important for our context, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is very famous for going into the cave for 12 years with his son, Rabbi Elazar, and they sit in sand up to their necks for 12 years. They emerge from the cave after 12 years. They find that the people around them are not keeping the mitzvot the way they want them to. So what happens? Their eyes become lasers and everything they point to is burned up. Obviously, very bad behavior. And this is absolutely frowned upon. And we constantly must absolutely condemn violent behavior done in the name of the Torah. So in this case, what does Hashem say? Nope, this is how you're going to treat my creation. You're clearly not ready to be in the world yet. Go back in the cave for another 12 years. And they go back for another 12 years. And that is a very important context to our text today. So we're told, we've got this interesting text where we're told that one should not be stiff like a cedar, one should be soft like the reed. One day, our rabbis taught. So when we learn Tanu Rabbanan, we're being taught a story, and usually, this is also called a ma'aseh, usually this is going to tell us something morally significant, and there's a reason that this is here, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. But we are taught about Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, and one day he was coming from Migdal Gadur, Now, Migdal Gador, another very important name, and I think this is intentional. Migdal Gador literally means the high and mighty great tower. So let's pause. Migdal Gador, the place where his rabbi was. The high and mighty tower where his rabbi was. Put that another way, the ivory tower. He is among the elite. He always has been, and he still is, from his childhood until today. And he's traveling on his horse, or on his donkey, excuse me, and he's traveling on the road going home. And his head is filled with pride because he learned so much halakha today from his rabbi. Oh, the Torah that I've learned, how wonderful. I'm riding on my donkey and I'm going home and I'm feeling great because all of this Torah that I've learned, I've absorbed it, feeling great. Well, he encounters a man on his way. And the man extends greetings to him. Greetings to you, my rabbi. And rather than returning this man's greeting, Rav Elazar ben Shimon says, oh, Reka, ugly. Are all of the people of your city as ugly as you are? And of course, we're thinking, oh my God, how could you respond with that way? And without missing a beat, what does this man say? I don't know, but maybe you should go to the craftsman who created me, going back to the idea of being created b'tselem Elokim, and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? And that is a point I want to reiterate. Why don't you go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? I think of Judy Heumann in this moment when she is confronting folks and saying, no, you cannot insult and marginalize and degrade disabled people. And again, we don't know if this man is disabled or not, but the point is there's clearly something about him that marks him as fundamentally different physically. And that fundamental physical difference marginalizes him and causes him to deal with direct discrimination. And Rav Elazar, realizing that he's done something extraordinarily wrong, or not, that's a question, descends from his donkey, prostrates himself, and begs for this man's forgiveness. And they keep walking. And he's begging for this man to forgive him. So you can imagine he's prostrating and he's crawling in this deeply supplicant posture. Oh my gosh, I have made a huge error here. But the man says, no, I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? They keep walking. And I imagine that this keeps repeating. And they get to Rav Elazar's town. And all the townspeople, all the throngs come out to greet him. Greetings to you, my rabbi, my master, my master. Man says, who are you calling my rabbi, my master, my master? Well, Rav Elazar, of course. Well, he did this terrible thing to me. Why are you calling this man your rabbi? He did this horrible thing to me on the road. And the townspeople say, well, can you please forgive him because he's a great Torah scholar? This is one of the best lines in the text. And the man says back, I'll forgive him so long as there are not many amongst him in the people of Israel. Mic drop. As one of my dear colleagues has said, this should be on the door of every rabbinical school. Mic drop. I will forgive him so long as he doesn't become accustomed to behaving that way, and so long as there are not many amongst him in the people of Israel. Okay, quite a bit to unpack. Then we return to the Beit Midrash. And from here, we learn that one should be soft like a reed, not hard like a cedar. And because the reed is soft, the reed merits to be turned into a quill, which is then used to write tefillin and mezuzot. Because we write our holy objects with softness and with flexibility. Now, interesting ending here, very ambiguous ending here. And it leaves us with a lot more questions than it answers. Does Rav Elazar do tshuva? Actually, some people in reading this text feel that the Reka is being overly harsh towards him. I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? And some people feel that absolutely no, he has not done tshuva. There's nothing to say that Rav Elazar has done tshuva. We get the story ending by saying, okay, go to the Beit Midrash and you should learn that you should be soft like a reed, not hard like a cedar. You should learn that. But has he learned that? That's the question that we never get answered. And I think that that is intentional. And I want us to remember the rabbis are recording anecdotes about themselves in their own work. Because the Talmud, when it was redacted and put together, we as the Jewish people today, many of us are learning Talmud in different ways. Many of us have had different exposures to Talmud. But when the Talmud came about, we were not the audience for that Talmud. The Talmud was intended for the rabbinic class. And the rabbinic class was a small group of people. And the rabbinic class tried to keep Judaism going after the destruction, which was an incredible rupture. How do you keep this tradition going when we've lost everything? And it took a few centuries for the Judaism as we know it to emerge. And we know that even up until the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, there were lots of Jews who did not accept rabbinic authority. They were called Karaites, and there are still Karaites today in much less numbers. But that is all to say that the Talmud, in its own self-understanding, was not a mass accessible text. This was meant for an elite few. So here we are, we have this text recording unsavory details. And that, I think, is incredibly important to lift up, especially because we're working with a text that's 1,500 years old. And it is still, to my mind, one of the most powerful texts. We'll be looking at another one in a minute, in a little bit. But one of the most powerful texts that our tradition has to talk about marginality and disability. Whether this man identified as disabled or not is actually not the question that I'm interested in. I'm interested in thinking about what this tells us about human dignity broadly. And I think it's very important that the thing that we get repeated in this text over and over and over again, go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? Rav Elazar is so proud of himself because he's learned all this Torah. But what good is the Torah that you learn if you encounter someone on the street and you diminish and degrade their humanity through insult? Unfortunately, this is not a text that we can leave in the past. That's why I bring it to us tonight, because we know that right now we live in a world where there are a lot of people who believe that they are doing Torah in all its fullness and yet diminish the divine spark in other human beings. That is not what our tradition calls us to do. And so when we use this text as a mirror to ourselves, we can unearth and we can begin to grapple with the ways in which we can live our tradition's highest values of who we are. That's not to say that the classical Jewish canon is all positive on disability. As anyone who has studied and immersed themselves in Jewish text on disability can know, there are many, many, many difficult and incredibly hard texts in the Talmud and in other places. And when we teach those texts, we do so with sensitivity, and also we do so without apology and say, yes, this is really, really hard. This does not reflect our values. Or we might ask the question, how does this actually reflect the world that many people live in? One of the things that is so important when we think about bringing in marginalized voices into the Torah conversation, it can be really threatening and scary, because many of us have invested a lot of our time and a lot of our energy, and we love this tradition and we love Torah. We're all here tonight because we love this tradition and we want to be learning together. And then we have a voice come in and they bring something in and that doesn't sound right to us, or the thing that we thought was really wonderful actually doesn't land well for that other person because of their own experience, or any number of things happen. But it gives us an opportunity to really ask ourselves the hard questions. And so too with this text, which is one of my most favorite, we have the opportunity through this story to ask ourselves really hard questions about the centrality of kavod and the centrality of kavod habriot. Kavod is an honor, and kavod habriot is the honor for all creation and all human beings. And I'm curious to think together a little bit about why was this man, why was he so quick to give such a beautiful, to my mind, theological retort? And why does this get framed as one should be soft like a reed, not hard like a cedar? Well, who is the one being soft and who is the one being hard? That's why when we think about Torah in its 70 faces, we have to ask ourselves, where am I coming from as I encounter the text? One could say that this man's retort, you should go to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? Well, that's a really hard retort. But as many people in the disability rights and justice communities will tell you, sometimes that tochacha, that rebuke, is coming from a place of incredible respect, even when it's hard, even when sometimes you want to turn around and just walk out the door. And even in those moments when even as a disability activist in the Jewish community who delves into Torah all the time, I make mistakes all the time. I get called in by other disabled activists all the time. And sometimes I want to just walk out the door and say, oh, I didn't hear that, I'm doing the best I can. What is this person trying to teach me? And if they didn't respect my work enough, they probably would not be calling me in this moment. So if this man, who we only know as Reka, unfortunately, we don't have a name for him, if he did not respect Rav Elazar, he moved on or internalized the shame or internalized the insult. Instead, he said, no, I'm standing up for myself. I'm standing up for my value. I'm standing up for my humanity. I'm standing up for my divinity. If you are attacking me in such an unfettered way, then you are attacking the divine that you claim to worship. Because I'm created in the image of God, just like any other human being. And regardless of my physical appearance, that is just as a part of the creation as anyone else. And so you can't insult me that way. When I teach this text to people with disabilities, often I get lots of very resonant responses. Yes, I've experienced that. Yes, I've been bullied. Yes, I've been mistreated. I can certainly empathize with the Reka in this text. I can certainly also empathize with Rav Elazar. Sometimes I'm having a moment where I'm feeling puffed up, where my ego is getting the better of me. And I'm then reminded of the reality that, in fact, as I learn from the Musar tradition and others, that I take space and I make space, no more than my place, no less than my space. That in fact, Rav Elazar was taking far more than his space and far more than his place. He didn't treat this man with the kavod that the man required by virtue of being a human being. He instead, rather than returning the greeting, said, oh, how ugly is this man? And if we remind ourselves again of this man's pedigree, where he came from, he is the son of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Did he not internalize the lessons from the cave? And to return to the central question, did he do tshuva? I think that that is an open question. I happen to have my own read on that. I don't believe he did. I think that he might have had a moment of shame, but he doesn't speak except to say, please forgive me, please forgive me. And the man says, no, not until you go to the craftsman, not until you've actually done your cheshbon, not until you've actually done your soul accounting, right? Because in our tradition, tshuva is not about forgiveness. It's nothing to do with forgiveness. Tshuva has to do with returning to right relationship and returning to the right path. Forgiveness, as we learn from Maimonides, from the Rambam in Hilchot Tshuva, we learn in his laws of forgiveness or of tshuva that in fact, we have to do the work first. We have to figure out why we did what we did, have sincere regret, and resolve to not do it again. But we don't actually know from this text if Rabbi Lazar actually did that, because all we have is his comment to his students. One should not be soft like one should be soft like a reed and not hard like a cedar. Okay, all right. But do we actually, as I said, that doesn't tell us anything about his own interior process. And I want us to remember, if we're thinking, wow, how could that ever happen? How could somebody be that egregious? How could somebody be that awful, that unkind to another human being? Unfortunately, ask anybody with a disability, any family member of a person with a disability, anybody anywhere adjacent to somebody with a disability or somebody who's otherwise marginalized. We have many, many stories. This is one of the ways in which ableism shows up every day. And so when we have Torah like this, that subverts that human tendency to insult and to degrade on its head, we are shown the best part of who we can be as lovers of Torah and lovers of Jewish tradition. This text is here. I've taught this to members of other of other religious traditions who are amazed that we have this in our Talmud, because it is so unvarnishedly self-critical in a way that is trying to lift us up and make us better people. That's the ultimate goal here. It's not to say we are irreparably bad and damaged and da-da-da. We don't hold that way in Judaism. Truth is always possible, but we have to take achriyut, responsibility for our own choices. And that ultimately is what this text is coming to teach us, I believe. And there's a lot we can unpack. I want to actually, before we open it to Q&A in a few minutes, I actually want us to explore the final text on our source sheet, which I'm going to just give a note about this text. It has a violent ending, and I think we can make a direct connection between this text that we're about to learn together and our prior text. But I will just name, this is it's a very complex text, but I think it has what to teach us as well. So I'm going to just put that out there and name that. The text we're about to go into now is from Brachot 58, I believe, and it is about Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet was a blind Amora. He was a blind Babylonian rabbi in the Beit Midrash, very learned, had many students. And this is coming in the context of a conversation. So Tractate Brachot is really about giving blessings and making blessings. And how do we do that, and at what times, and how are different blessings said, and on what occasions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really fabulous and fascinating tractate where the rabbis are trying to figure out, how do we elevate the mundane and make it holy? What is the way, or what is the way we can do that? How do we do that? So in this context, there's a conversation about the blessing you say upon encountering a king. And is there a blessing for a Jewish king versus a non-Jewish king? Now, let's bear in mind, at this time, there was no Jewish king. The Jews, in fact, not only was there no Jewish king, but we were living under incredible, incredible persecution by the Romans and by others in Babylonia. So there was no Jewish king. And whether the rabbis thought there ever would be in their lifetime, I think that's an open question. Nevertheless, we have this discussion. So one day, a bunch of rabbis go to greet the king. Non-Jewish king is coming. And Rav Sheshet says, I'm going with you. Wonderful. okay, great, fine, let him go. He's part of this community. There is, of course, as often happens in rabbinic text, we have an antagonist, and this is known as a mean. Now, a mean in this context is a heretic. That's the English translation. Somebody who's an adversary religiously or in other ways, somebody who's kind of a thorn in the side of the Jewish people, for any number of reasons. There are a lot of sectarian groups, one of them, of course, being the Christians, not the only one. There were plenty of others. But in this case, we have this mean. Again, we don't know anything about this guy, but he's bullying Rav Sheshet. He's like, well, a broken jug like you, why are you going to go see the king? Here we go. Same theme carries over. Rav Sheshet is a broken jug. And Rav Sheshet says, excuse me, no, I am here to see the king. And so I'm here. I know exactly what I'm doing to greet the king, just like everybody else. So the mean is not, or this gentleman, this interlocutor, this however we want to describe him, is not dissuaded from his line of argument and says, and in a moment of a lot of noise, the king is coming, the king is coming. Sheshet says, no, he's not coming. Let me show you that I actually know when the king is going to show up. And then a second time, this guy says, the king is coming. There's more noise. The king is coming. The king is coming. And Sheshet says, no, the king is not coming. Again, allow me to show you that I know when the king is going to come. And there's silence. The king is coming. And Rav Sheshet blesses the king because he knows the king is coming. So in the end, what happens to this other gentleman? There are a couple of endings. Either Rav Sheshet's eyes turned to lasers and he burned him up and became a pile of bones. And that is the rabbinic fantasy, or the fantasy that I could imagine in Rav Sheshet, that this heretic was ashamed of himself and Rav Sheshet somehow took his eyes and they became lasers. Now we're going to pause there and just note that is problematic and complicated from our modern perspective to think about a blind person having eyes turned to lasers and being able to point them and create a pile of bones out of an adversary, even if that is the kind of fantasy that one would entertain when one is feeling powerless, not powerful. We're just going to name that is problematic and difficult, but that is there in the text. But ultimately, what's going on here? Again, Rav Sheshet is standing up for his kavod. His kavod as a human being who, despite the fact that he does not have physical sight, certainly, and I can definitely attest to this in my own lived experience, and I think this is the point of the text, is saying, just because I don't have physical sight, that does not mean that I don't understand where I am, that I don't know what's going on, and that I can't bless the king when the king comes. And it also doesn't mean that I am a broken jug. It just means that my sensory experience of the world, of course, these are not the words that he would ever use, my sensory experience of the world is fundamentally different, but different is not bad. It just is. And I think in their own way, the Talmud is trying to tell us that, because the Talmud is not accepting that their colleague could be so insulted. Now, we could, of course, take this text and say, but don't they kind of have a little bit of self-interest because they obviously don't like their adversaries and they kind of want to make their adversaries out to be these terrible, wicked people? Well, perhaps. We'll never know. But I think that there's something really powerful in actually reading this text and saying, oh, we are accepting that our colleague experiences the world differently than we do, but that's not a bad thing. It just is the reality. And despite the deeply problematic nature of the ending, I think that there is what to say about what does it mean when you feel powerless to deal with someone who is, in one way or another, has more power than you do, whether because they have more ability than you do in this case, like for example, in this case, whether it's because they have more learning than you do in our prior text. How do you navigate that? And how often is it the case that many of us who have disabilities, who otherwise are marginalized, even I as a rabbi, who I often think of myself as both an insider and definitely an outsider, I think about these things all the time. And so often it feels like there's so many little injustices that chip away at our essential neshama, at our soul. And how do we reconstitute and remember that we are created b'tselem Elokim with the same level of kavod abriot as any other person? I think that perhaps the ending to our second text here, as challenging and frankly as awful as it is, I certainly in no way, shape, form condone, excuse me, I in no way condone this literary ending. I think that it is trying to show us that there are consequences and that we ought not behave in a way that denigrates the humanity of another person, lest our very humanity is denigrated. Because we know when we harm another, we harm ourselves most of all. And it's taken me a long time to learn that. But when we harm another person, we are harming our essential neshama, our essential holy spark. We are denigrating our own humanity. We are making ourselves less than we could and should be. And so with that, I really want to encourage us all as we move into the Q&A for the next while, to just be thinking about the ways in which Torah is many things. As the 12th century sage Nachmanides said, one can be an absolutely horrible person within the laws of the Torah. We, as human beings and as lovers of Torah and Judaism and Jewish tradition, we get to say and we get to make that active choice every day to live a Torah that elevates the humanity of every single person, as I believe the tradition calls us to do. So thank you so much, and I will turn it to Matt.
Thank you, Rabbi Tuchman, for sharing such important texts and narratives. I really appreciate the lessons that you've uplifted and allowing us all to ask ourselves hard questions, probably questions many of us haven't asked recently, at least, and hopefully we can reflect and possibly grow. So I'd like to go on with questions. For those of you with questions, please send them now through the Q&A button. And to get us started, how, looking at our Jewish canon, the voices of women with disabilities and those who are generally more marginalized in our society don't have a major voice, don't play a major role. And so I was wondering if you want to share more about how we can uplift those voices within our community today.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. It is such an important question, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about as I teach. One of the things that we can do a much better job of in the Jewish world, and I think we have the tools to do it, which is wonderful, we just need to really use them to the fullest, is to make sure that those voices that are modern, because unfortunately we don't have many ancient women's voices. It's not to say that Jewish women have not always had plenty to say, and that Jewish women with disabilities have not always had plenty to say, but our voices were not recorded in the way that others were. And truthfully, there are so many people whose voices we are missing. We really only have a very, very tiny subsection of the Jewish people whose voices have carried down through the generations. So in our time, as we are building on what came before, we can add our own voices, our own lived experiences to understand Torah. We can bring in wisdom that is from women with disabilities in the Jewish world, whether it is directly related to the Parsha or whatever we're learning. For example, I try to bring in a lot of Judy Human's wisdom tonight. She has an incredible memoir, Being Human, which teaches quite a bit about how to be in the world with maximum dignity and respect for all, particularly people with disabilities. We can draw lessons from those things and weave them into our shiurim. We can draw lessons from other works that have been out there, other classes. More and more is being made available online. And the reality is that we have a long way to go to catch up as women, and particularly women with disabilities. But that's not to say that we don't start now. And as we learn in Pirkei Avot, we are not commanded to finish the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. So it is a constant project. And I think the more we hear voices and the more we repeat them in the name of the one who spoke. So I tried to do that with multiple folks tonight. We are elevating that teaching. We're elevating the holy spark of that teaching, and we are bringing it to more and more people. I think that is a key thing that we all can do.
Thank you. And in that light, there's another question here that Rabbi Gil Steinloff published a wonderful. I'm reading the question here. Published a wonderful article in honor of Judy Human yesterday, in which he spoke about her rebuking him for the way he dealt with the teaching on disabilities, and how this changed his entire way of thinking about his rabbinate. Do you think that of your role, in part, like Judy's was then, is to teach the teachers?
So I have read Rabbi Steinloff's article. It was incredible. I really recommend that everyone take a moment to read it. Yes, I do. I do see that as my professional role in a lot of ways, is to teach the teachers. And I think that it gets to, again, to the larger question of whose voices were in the room. I cannot tell you how many classes I sat through in rabbinical school and other places where texts on disability were taught in such harmful ways, and people didn't. I don't think that there was an ill intent, but if you don't have the voice of the person in the room who has the lived experience, it's really hard to teach this text. I mean, and this shows up also in terms of how, as women, particularly how we teach difficult texts that have to do with women, right? We're learning, thank God, we're learning more and more today about how to teach Torah in a beautiful and sensitive way so that it actually can feel close instead of this thing that's far away. If you haven't read the article, I'll just make a mention for those who have not read the article. I strongly recommend it. He talks in there, and I know Rabbi Steinloff personally as well, and he talks in the article about how Judy brought 40 of her friends to the synagogue, which I can totally believe. And they went through these texts, and people had really strong reactions to them, both negative, mostly negative, and some positive. And I'll tell you, I read that paragraph, and as a teacher of Torah, what was my first thought? My first thought was defensiveness. This is something I love, and yes, there's ableism, and yes, there's marginality, and yes, there's all kinds of stuff. But this is somebody's sacred tradition. That was my first thought. And I went back and I read that paragraph again, and I still was in that space of like, this is my holy tradition. Don't ridicule my holy tradition. And then I had to go beyond that and say, okay, what is the intent? And I think particularly as Jews, this is a really tough one, because we, for very good reason, are very protective of our texts, because unfortunately, we live in a world in which many people are more than happy to denigrate us and to tell us that we, our covenant is no longer applicable and that we aren't who we say we are. We deal with that stuff all the time. That's real. And that can't ever be outside the conversation. So when I'm teaching the teachers, I'm very intentionally doing so as a committed Jew who is doing this because I care and love this tradition, and I want the best for us as a people, and because I firmly believe that Torah can be this incredible and is this incredible source of wisdom. When we encounter those really difficult texts, I can sit with rabbis and others, and we can go over them, and I can say, this is why this is so harmful to people with disabilities, to disabled people, and it's coming from that place. And I think ultimately that Gil's article, that Rabbi Steinloff's article, really talks about that. That's ultimately what that meeting was about. And that through that process, after I got through my own defensiveness in response to the article, I realized oh, of course, this is how we learn, even when it's really, really hard. So thank goodness we are living at a time now when we are able to learn Torah from a more diverse array of voices than we ever have. And I hope that the more we do that, the more we all will be teaching the teachers.
Great, thank you. And there was a question here about sending a link to the article, and so we'll be sure to do that in our follow-up materials for everyone. There's two follow-up questions that are related. One is whether or not there's more people such as yourself, Jewish leaders in the community who are teaching in this field, others that maybe you haven't mentioned, and whether or not there's clergy and other religious traditions who are working in the same area that you're familiar with, and if there's other insights you have from those traditions.
Yeah, I love this question. So yes, I am so excited and delighted to be able to lift up a few of my other teachers in this space. Particularly Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer is an incredible teacher of Torah and disability Torah in particular. And she's coming out with a new book, I believe, about that in the fall, God willing. Her name is Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer. For those of us in the Washington area, she is local to us. She is a professor at Georgetown University, and she speaks often about the intersection between Judaism and disability, and also between Judaism and climate change, and how that all relates to disability. So her work is very important. I strongly recommend people look her up. I would also say, in terms of teachers with disabilities who have been trailblazers in the Jewish tradition, I would be utterly remiss not to mention Rabbi Rebecca Dubow, who was the first deaf woman ever ordained a rabbi. She is an incredible mentor and friend of mine, and was ordained at HUC many, many years ago. She has done incredible work in the deaf community and then broadly around disability in Judaism. And so that's another Rabbi Rebecca Dubow, Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer. There's also Rabbi Darby Lee, who also is deaf. And we have a variety of other folks who are currently in process. We have in rabbinical school who will be, God willing, ordained rabbis soon. We also have rabbis in prior generations, including Rabbi Michael Levy, who was the first blind man ordained at JTF, I believe. I am the first blind woman in the world to be ordained a rabbi. He was the first blind male rabbinical student many, many, many decades ago. He has also done a lot of work in his own way. And yeah, I would say we have a lot of really, really wonderful teachers of Torah. Rabbi Amelie Aviva Kapoor is also another teacher of Torah. So we are very fortunate, and we have a growing number. And some folks who are people with disabilities may not identify so readily as well. So that's something also to just bear in mind. I also would recommend Jess Velasco wrote a piece in Lilith magazine many years ago, Are These Sufferings Dear to You? My Disability, Its Isolation and Discontent, which is a meditation really on their experience with chronic illness and their experience with their own disability and how that intersected and often made it very difficult to access Jewish community, and still often does. So the insights that Torah, that people with disabilities are bringing to Torah are really important, especially now with the world we are living in that has been utterly transformed by the COVID pandemic. And there are many people with disabilities still, particularly in the chronic illness community, for whom access to Jewish learning and access to Jewish community is deeply limited by an inability to be in person. So Jess Velasco in particular, if you're looking for Torah about that, is the person to go to. So that would be my recommendation. And then in terms of other communities, there are certainly clergy with disabilities across faith traditions, certainly in Christianity as well. There is an organization called the Institute on Theology and Disability. They have a summer conference. It is predominantly a Christian conference. There are a few Jews who go. It's a little bit funny for me. The one time I went, there were more blind folks than Jews. And when people found out I was Jewish, it was a huge deal. They're like, "You're Jewish?" The fact that I was blind was totally like, whatever. Wow, you're Jewish? That's so cool. I was like, it was a very, very interesting and funny response. But they are out there. I recommend folks looking into them. And I am seeking to do more work in the interfaith space. So I am always looking to grow in that area.
Great, thank you. You've mentioned before some of the more difficult texts, going back to the text here, in our tradition. I don't know if you want to say anything more. There's a question here about how, some of the process or how maybe potentially reconciling some of those difficult texts, such as the example here given is the high priest is to be a perfect physical specimen.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any thoughts to share on how on some of your work on reconciling those, or how you relate to those texts.
Yeah, so one of the things that I would say from the outset, and when I think about pedagogy in particular, when it comes to disability texts that are really, really difficult, and I think this can apply to women's issues and lots of other things as well, it is a very lengthy process. It's never the first thing I would, if I'm teaching a group of folks that don't have a lot of Jewish backgrounds, I am always very honest and transparent that Judaism has complicated texts. We inherited a very messy, very human tradition. And when I say very human tradition, I mean the rabbis don't claim to sugarcoat anything. This is a deeply, deeply real tradition. And part of what that means is that there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of schmutz. There's a lot of stuff that we have to deal with and grapple with. And there's a tendency in our tradition, for I think really understandable reasons, but it's a tendency that I would encourage us to put aside, to try to smooth over, to try to make things not as bad or not as hard. And I think it's coming from a place of feeling like we Jews are constantly we're constantly being criticized, constantly this, constantly that. And this Torah is precious, so I don't want to be adding to that fire. That's a completely understandable impulse. But what happens is if we go that way, then people are feeling like what they're experiencing is not acknowledged. So what I try to do as a teacher of Torah is to actually say, no, this is really hard. And the high priest is a very good example. And what's really ironic about this is that we learned earlier in Exodus that Moshe had a speech impediment, and that God says to Moshe, who made people with disabilities? Who made you as you are? I'll give you a reasonable accommodation. You are a perfect specimen. And then we get to Leviticus, and we're told that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and really any Kohen actually, in order to serve in the temple, has to be without a mum, without a quote blemish. And then the Torah lists what those blemishes are, and it is excruciating to read. And one can say, well, that only applies to the Kohen, and the Kohanim don't even have a rule anymore, aside from in some shuls having the first aliyah and not going to a cemetery, and also doing duchaning, doing birkat Kohanim. Okay, fine, but other than that, the Kohanim don't really have a role anymore. But that doesn't answer the question, what do you do with a really difficult text? It's basically saying the one who is serving in this mishkan that we're learning all about right now has to be a perfect, quote unquote, specimen. And one of the ways that I resolve it is to honestly say, this is really, really hard. What does this have to tell us about who we are? Right? The text is the text. We get to be responsible interpreters of it. There's a really good impulse to say, this is terrible. This is not only is this completely ableist, it's completely misogynist, it's completely patriarchal. I, as a deeply committed feminist, can certainly understand there are lots of ways of doing and being a Jewish feminist. And one impulse within many in that conversation is to say, this text is problematic. We're not dealing with it anymore. The reason that is an impulse that I both understand and don't subscribe to is because if I decide to not deal with the text anymore, well, somebody else is going to find it and they're going to deal with it in a very different way than I would. And unfortunately, I think that we are seeing what happens when we choose to discard the texts that are hard and not investigate them. We allow others with much more exclusionary motives to do so. And I think we need to take the baton and say, yes, this is really hard. This is really difficult. I don't need to make it easier. What I can do is be intellectually and spiritually honest that this is really, really hard. It's here. And sometimes the answer of what to do with it is to, as Rabbi Sharon Brous said in a very famous sermon she gave years and years ago, that my tears become enmeshed with the page that I'm learning. Because that too is Torah. If we're all part of this chain of tradition, that too is Torah. And so that's one approach to it. Another approach that I've taken often is to look at what the Mishnah has to say. And in Mishnah Megillah, which is appropriate because we just had Purim, there's a whole conversation, because originally that tractate's all about the reading of the Megillah. Actually, this is in the Gemara, excuse me, not in the Mishnah. The tractate is about reading the Megillah, but then it gets talking about laws of Torah reading, and then it gets talking about lots of things related to synagogue ritual. So this issue comes up of, well, what do you do about this Kohen issue? And what do you do about the fact that they can't have a mum? And like, what does that mean? And the rabbis say, well, this is about us, actually. The problem is we get distracted by difference, and we get distracted. And so we're not going to be as attentive or solemn as we would be for Birkat HaKohanim because we're distracted. And then the rabbis say in that same bit of Gemara, but if you know this person for 30 days and they are a regular in your community, then this issue of having a mum doesn't apply anymore because it's not an issue. It's not a distraction. And we could nitpick and say, well, this is a problem, like we shouldn't be distractions. Let's be really honest with ourselves. We all are distracted by things in our environment that we are not expecting. We have to take responsibility for that again. And I think this is what the rabbis are saying. It's like, I don't understand that. And we as Jews, I think it's very, very hard to not understand. We are deeply intellectual people. I think that's one of our greatest strengths. We always are wanting to question and ask and understand. So what does it mean to not understand something or to be distracted? We get to be like, I'm going to take a moment, and I'm going to notice that I wasn't expecting that the Kohen who was going to be doing the blessing had a scar on his hand or was blind or whatever. And this happens to me all the time. I'm sure every time I get up to give to take an aliyah or to teach something, there may be somebody in the room who's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. And then you pause, and hopefully we learn the skill of, that's for me to investigate. Many of us do not learn that skill, and many of us externalize that onto the person that we don't understand. So we have to be careful about that. But I think the rabbis are really asking us to take that into consideration in their own language, in their own way. So that is my very long answer, I'm sorry, to a very important question.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. And like, as you say, we live in our Judaism is a tradition of continued interpretation, and what says, like you said, you mentioned going to the Mishnah, what it says in the Talmud, we have or what it says in the Torah, we have the Talmud, we have Rashi, the Shulchan Aruch, we go, we continue to interpret the text and learn from them. So I appreciate that. I feel like there's one main question that I think will summarize, not summarize, but I want to ask, and then you can sort of summarize maybe if you have any final thoughts. You began with Musar, and there's a couple of questions here about text or prayers that you could recommend for facilitating the process of growth. So that reminded me sort of your beginning with Musar, and whether or not you have anything else you want to add about practices that Judaism teaches, awareness building or mindfulness or text-based practices that you feel are relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's very important to know about Musar, there are a lot of great organizations. And if I don't want to distract from our talk tonight, so if anyone is interested in that, I can certainly talk to you offline about recommendations. But the thing about Musar that I think is so powerful, and the modern Musar movement is very different than the Musar movement of the 19th century, and my Musar teachers constantly remind me of that, because we are living in a time where we are so hard on ourselves. So many of us just beat ourselves up all the time. And that's not what Musar is about today. We are really about strengthening ourselves and doing it in community. So that was going to be the first thing I was going to say, is that Musar is practiced in avad in a group, because we're not meant to do this work on our own. Because especially for those of us who are women, and I am particularly grateful for the women who are teaching Musar today, we were socialized to be small, to beat ourselves up, to be really harsh and really hard on ourselves. And so Musar is a way of working on our soul traits, but doing so in really deep relationship with other people, so that we are not only being held accountable by them, but we are being held accountable to our spiritual growth for the betterment of ourselves and the betterment of everybody in our orbit. One of the things that I love, a Musar quote that really, really means a lot to me, is every one holy soul. And I'm blanking on who said that. If anybody knows, put it in the chat. But every one, comma, holy soul, every human being, holy soul. Ultimately, that's what we are at our essence. So when we work on those soul traits, we are amplifying that, and each of us has our own individual curriculum. That's what the Musarniks say, that our own individual curriculum, we are each going to have stronger aspects and weaker aspects, quote unquote. But there's also a really wonderful book called the Musar Torah Commentary that was published recently by the CCAR Press, which, if you're looking for a Musar lens from a very modern perspective on the weekly Parsha, it's a great resource. And there's also the Everyday Holiness by Alan Morenis, also by my teacher, Rabbi David Jaffe, Changing the World from the Inside Out, both two really wonderful books. But I think in terms of a focus phrase, which is one of the key things in Musar, that the one that I just named, every one holy soul, is a really just beautiful reminder of how we're meant to be in the world.
Thank you. I see one other question popped up from Sandy Mendelson here. Can you recall an example of a rabbinic passage that you reject as being at odds with our current value system?
Yes, absolutely. And I apologize. I was thinking about this earlier today, and I don't recall the exact citation. But there is a rabbinic idea, there's a rabbinic teaching that there are three states of being, that if one is any of those things, it is as if they were dead. One of them is blindness. Now, we can go all kinds of ways with that one, but I am not going to sit here and say that I can reconcile that text, because I absolutely cannot. And I have had many people ask me about what to do with this. What do I do if I'm teaching this? The other ones are to be, I think one of them is poor, folks who are poor, it is if they are dead. And forgive me, I am not remembering the third one. But with the rabbis, if I'm being the most charitable that I can be in this moment, I think the rabbis are talking here that in their context, if you were somebody who was that marginalized, you really had so little resources, your prospects for a decent life were just completely unattainable. And that's still true for many of our fellow human beings today. Now, taken completely out of context, the idea that blindness is equated with death, unfortunately, I wish I could say that that's one of those views that I'd love to put in the past and pretend that we've moved on. But unfortunately, there are many, many people still today who feel that way. Blindness is one of the most feared disabilities. People are absolutely freaked out by blindness and by blind people. It's why I think we are still one of the most marginalized disabled groups, although probably every disabled group would tell you that. So I kind of have to, in some ways, take that with a grain of salt. But I do think that there are statistics and surveys to kind of bear out what I'm saying about fear of blindness. And for a lot of people, the idea of becoming blind is, as it's almost like I would rather be dead than disabled. There's a line called, that people often say in the disability activist community, that they and we often feel that many people have the idea better dead than disabled. So in that kind of a context where we know that that discrimination is alive and well, even though in its original rabbinic context, I think this genuinely had to do with the realities of daily life, and genuinely had to do with the reality that people had very different experiences depending on who they were, which is still true today. that is not a text that I would ever teach in a shiur. That is the kind of a thing that I would only do with somebody one-on-one after they had learned sufficient Torah and after they had enough of an understanding of how the rabbinic project worked. And I think finally, I'll say my last comment on that point is that rabbinic Judaism is very, very unique in its self-understanding, and how that then get translated to the rest of the Jewish world is a really interesting process. That is to say, rabbinic Judaism is, as we are all practicing today, however we identify Jewishly, because that's ultimately what happened historically, but it's not to say that that has to always be the case. And it's not to say that we shouldn't interrogate or ask a lot of questions about the assumptions that a lot of our sages held.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree very much so. And we still have a few minutes. I don't know if you have any final thoughts that you would like to end on or reiterate for our audience.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that so much of, I really believe deeply that Torah at its very heart is about v'ahavta l'recha chamocha, to love our neighbor. That is at the very heart of the Torah. It's in the very middle of the Torah. And that this is how we live it out through our own growth, our own transformational change. And it begins with ourselves, because it's very easy to point outwards. And honestly, there's much to say and much to critique, but it's really important, as one of my teachers, Rav Eitan Tucker, talked about in a piece that he wrote last week about Shabbat Zachor. Sometimes we have to put that lens up to our own selves. And I believe that within a grounded and supportive space that is allowing us to do the action to make this world a little bit better, we can do that work. It's very hard. It's very demanding. We are always in process. That's why it's a practice. But I ultimately believe that Torah it encourages and really requires that of us. And anything short of that is not living Torah in its highest value. That's what I really want to impress upon all of us tonight.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful point for us to end on. Thank you again, Rabbi. This has been a very important lecture, and you have such words of wisdom to share with all of us. So I greatly appreciate that. And I'm sure our audience also does so. And thank you all out there for joining us. In our follow-up materials, we'll be sure to include some sources that have been discussed tonight. We'll send you links and book recommendations. So thank you all again for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you all so much.